Well, it is now 10:30, and it's time for Brainstorming the Human Connection, brought to you by the South Dakota Humanities Council. My name is Lawrence Diggs. I will be your host today, but I like to remind people right at the top of the show that this is an interactive program. We invite and desire your participation with questions, comments, discussion. We try to make this a safe place for people to exchange ideas, get practice in bringing their thoughts together and discussing and sharing them with other people. That is really the point of the program. So it's not supposed to be just a two-way discussion between myself and whichever guest we have, but also you're included, and your input and queries helps to bring some new insight to the conversation, because all of us will always be smarter than any one of us. So bring it on, as they say. Today, we have as our guest David Adler, who's a historian and president of the Alturas Institute. And we're going to be talking about the recent, Sandra Day O'Connor's life. And in case you're not familiar with that name, on the off chance that you're not, she was the first woman appointed to the Supreme Court of the United States, and she died recently. And her body will be laying in repose on Monday, next Monday, December 18th, in the Great Hall of the Supreme Court. She was quite a figure, especially being the first woman being on the Supreme Court. That already is a kind of a unique position, because all those kind of first, they're pioneers, and they're kind of on the bleeding edge, and lots of things come together to make that first happen. It was way too late, but at least it got started. And since that time, we've had a few other women on the Supreme Court, and we look forward to more. David, you've been thinking about and writing about Sandra Day O'Connor, and you've become familiar with it. But before we get into that, can you give those who are not familiar with you, because you've been on this program before, so if you just tell us a little bit about who David is.
Oh, thank you, Lawrence. It's great to be with you again. Great to see you again. I always enjoy your show very, very much. So as you pointed out, I'm president of the Alturas Institute, headquartered here in Idaho. And we're a nonprofit educational organization dedicated to defending American democracy by promoting the Constitution, civic education, equal protection of the law, and gender equality. And these areas have very much reflect my interest as a scholar for several decades. I was a professor of constitutional law at various universities here in Idaho and elsewhere. And I've written extensively about the Constitution, about the Supreme Court. And my interest in Justice O'Connor, I should say, of course, began with her appointment in 1981, when Ronald Reagan fulfilled a campaign promise and named her to the Supreme Court. But then it became much deeper, I would say, as she rendered important opinions. And finally, in two successive years, Lawrence, 2013 and 2014, when I organized and hosted a conference on women in leadership out here in Boise, she was a guest. And I interviewed her extensively on stage both years. And it was a marvelous experience. I got the chance to spend time with her, deep in conversation, and thoroughly enjoyed it. There's so much to say about
Right.
this first woman on the Supreme Court, as you noted. So
Mm.
I'm really looking forward to our conversation today.
Let's go back and get to know Sandra Day O'Connor a little bit. Can you tell us about her background, where she was born, or anything like that? Do you have any information like that?
Sure, sure. Well, she's quite a figure. She was a very independent woman, and it undoubtedly reflected her upbringing. She was born to a ranch on the border of Arizona and Texas, and it was a very large, sprawling ranch, and it was very isolated. The nearest town was 35 miles away. The nearest home was 12 miles away. So she learned very early that life on the Lazy Bee Ranch, her father's ranch, meant that you needed to take care of yourself. Whatever your needs were, you better be able to handle them. And she did. So she was riding horses, she was herding cattle. She was changing tires at a young age. She learned to drive when she was about 10 years old, as many children do on farms and ranches, as we know. But she became, as I say, a very independent woman, loved to hunt, loved to fish. She loved the water. She was an avid outdoors woman, let me say,
Mhm.
who enjoyed being outside. Uh, she had what we would all envy, an inexhaustible state of energy from her time as a young girl to the very end of her life. And she always looked for ways to spend that energy. At any rate, she was also very bright, which is not going to surprise anybody. And she left the Lazy Bee to attend Stanford at the age of 16. So she was a young college student, did very, very well, deeply interested in government and political science and history and law, actually majored in economics, stayed at Stanford to attend law school. And what an interesting career she had at the Stanford Law School. She finished second in her class. The top student, if we could characterize him that way, was a fellow named William Rehnquist, who of course would later become Justice and then Chief Justice Rehnquist. And Sandra Day O'Connor and Bill Rehnquist actually dated for a while. He
Hmm.
was probably more interested in her than she was in him. Along the way, she met another law student, and this probably explains why Bill Rehnquist was second in her heart. His name was John O'Connor. They ended up marrying. So she found a lot of good things at Stanford: first rate education, a future Supreme Court seatmate, a husband whom she adored. And then the story is not going to surprise us either, Lawrence, because here's a woman graduates at the top of her class, 1950. She cannot find a job. Why can't she find a job despite her high standing, her high intelligence? Because law firms were not hiring women. In fact, she told the story about how the one interview, imagine this, one single interview that she did receive, the interviewer asked, "How fast can you type? How are your typing skills?" So, so
Nobody ever asked me that.
yeah, and I wasn't asked that, fortunately. And so she's doing her best to find a job, but she can't do it. Meanwhile, on the East Coast, just to draw an analogy to the similar plight of another young woman, a legal genius named Ruth Bader, later Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She had graduated from the top of her class, couldn't find a job for the same reasons. Isn't that amazing? At the same time, two women on the
Mhm.
opposite coast, the left coast, the right coast, and
Mhm.
they can't find a job. At any rate, sticking with Sandra Day O'Connor, she finally volunteered to work at a law firm, and they did hire. She began her law work, and then she became a deputy assistant in the prosecutor's office in Arizona, in Phoenix, I should say. She took, and of course, people immediately noticed her brilliance. You just couldn't pass on that. Suddenly, to some extent, those lines of gender discrimination began to melt away when they saw her at work. She made her way in politics. She was deeply interested in politics for much of her life, and her temperament and personality suited her for that pursuit. And in 1969, she was appointed to a vacancy in the Arizona legislature. She rose rapidly, Lawrence, so that in 1972, she was chosen by her colleagues to become Senate Majority Leader, the first
Mm,
female in the history of the Arizona legislature and the first woman in the history of the country to become majority leader
mm.
in a state legislature. That was her first, we might
Wow.
say, before we joined the court.
Right, right.
Much to say about this.
Mm,
She caught the attention of many people in power. She was praised for her ability to draw sides together. She learned early on that in politics, and this later was very useful to her in her key role on the court. She learned early in politics that compromise was the key. Compromise it was, as you and I have discussed previously on your show, is the engine of democracy. So
sure.
she would gather people at a local place for chats and chapel and chats and various kinds of food. People on different sides of the aisle, and they used to sit there and drink a while, and soon they'd find their way to compromise. You know,
Mm.
if people aren't angry drunks, they can be happy and they can agree on things that used to set them apart.
Yeah.
She liked to say, borrowing this from her late husband John, that you don't have to drink to have fun, but why take the chance? And
Exactly.
so she was the life of the party. This other side to Sandra Day O'Connor, she was the life of the party. She entertained. She had a big personality. She had a presence in the room, whether it was in your room or my room or in the legislative arena or in an auditorium or the Supreme Court. She moved quickly, as I say, through the ranks of politics, catching attention and then she was appointed to the appellate court in Arizona. She was elected to the appellate court in Arizona. William Rehnquist, who was already on the Supreme Court now by 1979, he was of course appointed by Richard Nixon, suggested to Ronald Reagan uh, be, that if you want to fulfill your promise, your campaign promise to be the first president to put a woman on the court, I have just the woman for you. He
Mm.
recommended Reagan, as did others. And finally, she was, in fact, nominated and confirmed and became the first female justice on the Supreme Court in 1981.
So you have uncovered the relationship between her and William Rehnquist. What effect do you think it had on their working relationship? Can you talk a little bit about how they worked together since they had a former connection?
Yeah, yes. That's an excellent question. They worked very well together. They remained fast friends, just purely friends. Their respective spouses were friends. The Supreme Court often gathered socially over the years for different events, for little parties, to get-togethers, to create an atmosphere of camaraderie. For example, Justice Ginsburg's husband, Marty, in addition to being one of maybe the top tax attorney in the country, was a marvelous cook. So everybody on the Supreme Court wanted to have parties and ask Marty to cook. Well, So the court gathered frequently, and they all brought their respective talents. Some sang, some played the piano. So she and Rehnquist remained friends. They worked well together. The reality is that they were cut from the same mold, we might say. Perhaps it's the influence of the Stanford Law School, but they were centrist. Certainly, Rehnquist was further to the right politically than was Justice O'Connor, but she was very much a pragmatist, lined up almost on the 50-yard line. She would lean. She was definitely a Republican in her politics, but didn't lean too far right of the 50-yard line. They worked together to carve out what in those days would be considered centrist opinions. Both had an element of pragmatism. She would say she always had deep affection and respect and admiration for the Chief Justice. He reciprocated. So it was interesting that those two could be friends on the court because it would bring an element of balance to the court. And of course, Sandra Day O'Connor was known as the swing vote for much of her career on the court, even though she was too modest to accept that. I think she liked it because who wouldn't relish power and the ability to control the ultimate outcome of a vote. And she was very, very savvy. This Western woman was very savvy, and she appreciated her position, but it provided a certain centrist element to the court during their years together.
What can you say about her in general from a 50,000-foot view of the kind of judge she was?
Yeah, that's a good question because even though she was conservative politically, she nevertheless was not a doctrinaire judge. Unlike some of her colleagues at the time, Justice Scalia, for example, or Justice Thomas, or her successor, Samuel Alito, who were very doctrinaire, whom she would criticize for being extraordinarily bound to what she perceived to be their rules bound jurisprudence, not allowing room for judgment or discretion or pragmatism. She was, above all, pragmatist. And this, I think, was a function of her early career, where she well understood the intersection between politics and law, having one foot in the Arizona legislature and then soon thereafter serving in the appellate court in Arizona. She knew how important it was to find consensus on the court, any court. She was fond of saying, I just need five. Just give me 5 votes on the Supreme Court. And so she worked to find consensus, recognizing that the law, in her view, should move slowly. It should move incrementally so as to stay in tune with society, not to get too far in front of various viewpoints or movements, nor lag behind, I should say. That was very important. But that's not to say she was not a woman without strong beliefs or principles, because she surely was. And we see that, for example, in some of her important opinions in key areas that are at the center of great dispute today in America. One would be abortion rights, of course, and she was a steadfast defender of a woman's right to choose. Another area would be affirmative action. She was concerned about maintaining separation of church and state, and other areas as well. And I think because she was very strong and savvy, and she knew that some on the court on her far right would try to push her around or bully, but she didn't give them traction. You know, all of us, when we come to face to face with a bully or somebody who wants to engage in an argument or even a fight, have different ways of responding. She just moved on, not letting her opponent gain traction, which of course would frustrate her opponent, uh,
Yeah.
who was really excited about it. So as a judge, then Lawrence, she was very savvy. She was a pragmatist, a centrist, and it was of deep concern to her that the court should be known as a law court, not a political court. She said over and over again, we should not be viewed as politicians because that would undermine the respect for the Supreme Court, and it would be very injurious to the court, which is why I think she came to regret her vote in Bush versus Gore in 2000, which finally settled the tight race between Al Gore and George Bush for the presidential race. Because when the court decided 5-4 to stop the recount in Florida, which was the pivotal state, as it often is, that meant that George Bush would hang on to his very narrow victory, just 500 votes. Imagine that, 500 votes separating, you'll remember, separating Gore and Bush. When the Supreme Court overruled the Florida Supreme Court's decision to let the recount go forward, that stopped the recount for all intents and purposes, ended the presidential race, awarded Al Gore the 25 votes, the 25 electoral votes, and he won the presidency. She later regretted her decision. And so there's a great what if question.
What if I think you meant they gave it to Bush, right?
It gave it to Bush. Yes, I'm so sorry. Did I misspeak? Yes, thank you.
That's okay.
Yeah, that's a what if question. What if Gore had been right? Excuse me. Thank you for catching me. That's right. She regretted her vote and wished that the court had not taken the case. And there was a reason, because historically the Supreme Court defers to the decisions of a state Supreme Court, and the Rehnquist Court, as it was known there, was very clearly supportive of allowing state Supreme Courts to have the last word. So much of that case bothered her, and therefore it is a great what if question. Would Al Gore have been elected if, in fact, the Supreme Court had not entered the fray? We'll never know. Yeah,
that's right. And what a different world it might have been, with that.
Yes. Different.
And you think it came down to 500 votes. That's, when people say, "Oh, my vote doesn't count," you said, I think you better go back and study a little history.
Well, you're so right. And isn't that maybe a cautionary tale for us now? Because remember, that race was so close, and Ralph Nader was an independent candidate, won enough votes from Al Gore. And that if he had not been in the race, Gore would have won Florida, and Gore would have been the president. So at that point, as your memory well serves, Nader had said there's not enough difference between these candidates. We need to have a real choice.
Yeah.
That's what we're hearing these days, right?
That's right. And I think those are kind of, how can you say, they're kind of smoke screens. They're kind of like duck and dodge things. People throw that out to try to get people to not vote, and therefore, sort of swing over to their side. But that's a different discussion that we should have, by the way.
Right.
But at this point, I would like to open it up to our esteemed guest to see if anyone has questions or comments, recollections, whatever. Anybody have any contributions to this conversation? Just sort of unmic yourself and join in. Sometimes people take a while to say, "Well, I was going to say something, but I don't know."
Always great to get questions. Yeah,
that's right. And if you think of any, just unmic yourself. We can, and we'll hopefully we'll see that, and then we'll just break in. I'd like to go back to the Bush versus Gore thing, because she had some similar decisions to make. I believe in the wasn't she part of the Citizens United? Wasn't she still?
Well, that's a great question. And she had just retired from the court, and she regretted her decision to retire in part because her
Mm,
successor in '06 was Samuel Alito,
mm,
and she fretted about the appointment of Alito, whom she confided in friends at the time. Now, this is February 1 of '06 that she announces her retirement. She
mm,
stays on the court until a successor can be nominated. That took about 5 or 6 months. Then
mm,
Alito is that successor named to the court by George W. Bush. And when Citizens United came up just a few short years later, she was so concerned about that because she wanted to keep a control on campaign expenditures and so forth. On the day that that case was argued, she found a conspicuous seat in the gallery at the Supreme Court so that her colleagues could see where she was seated. They would remember how she felt.
mm.
It didn't work, of course, because as you know, Citizens United represented, uh, in her mind, certainly a terrible decision. Thought Justice Kennedy, who wrote the opinion, was very naive, thinking that big money does not influence politics. Probably, in
Yeah,
my view, probably the most naive line in the
yeah,
history of Supreme Court jurisprudence.
right,
But
right.
that reflected her deep-seated concern about the role of money in selecting judges. She was a fierce opponent to the very end of election of state judges because, as she said, the last thing we want is cash in the courtroom. We don't
Yeah,
want we don't want somebody on the other side of us in a legal dispute to be a person who's contributing to a judge's campaign coffers. That
right.
just destroys the idea of judicial independence, uh, undermines our confidence in the judiciary. So that was just one decision, by the way, that bothered her about Alito. And as she said, she feared that Alito, who's doctrinaire, very much like Scalia, as she described it, would end up overturning or undermining many of her important decisions. And indeed, he did, because he wrote the opinion in the Dobbs case, which overturned Roe versus Wade, and
Mm,
thereby her very important 1992 abortion decision, Planned Parenthood versus Pennsylvania, of which she remained justly proud. And many thought it was a terrific approach, saying that states do have the authority to regulate abortions,
mm,
but may not impose an undue burden on a
right.
woman's right to choose. I really admired the undue burden test. I thought it was a great approach.
But now, when she was nominated by Reagan, didn't she get a lot of pushback? And Reagan got kind of like, you know, some eggs thrown and tomatoes thrown at him because there are people who they didn't think she was strong enough on their side of that abortion issue.
Well, you're exactly right. And even though presidents will deny that they have a litmus test when they are vetting uh, potential nominees, the Reagan administration very much had one, and it was abortion,
Mm,
as you point out. And they thought that they had done their homework. They thought that Sandra Day O'Connor would be a vote to overturn Roe versus Wade, which she decidedly was not. She made it clear early in her career on the court she was not going to be the first woman to vote to overturn a woman's right to choose. And
yeah,
she
that didn't
was,
make any sense.
I admired her outspoken comments on this issue. She thought, and she said it many times, that if women can't exercise that right to choose to govern their reproductive organs, they essentially lose their autonomy, because she said that will affect their ability, their autonomy to make decisions about education, about careers, about
Yeah,
family, so
yeah.
many areas. So she thought that it was a fundamental right, and she was terribly upset about the direction that the court was taking then and threatening Roe versus Wade and its successor decisions.
Yes. Well, I found that was a very interesting kind of dilemma, but I think Ronald Reagan was kind of in a corner because he had made a big campaign promise about putting a woman on the Supreme Court. And if you're going to try to find someone, especially of that caliber, who you know, because if it's going to be the first woman, she's got to be a standout all-star because everybody's looking like, well, can women do it? And so you can't like have somebody who's like on the B team or the C team that you put up just because they do the abortion, because actually you have more cases than abortion cases. And so he had to have somebody that he could, you know, that had the acumen, you know, and the stature to stand up to it, and also the demeanor. But at the same time, you know, if it's going to be a woman, your choices of somebody who doesn't see, you know, of that caliber, who doesn't see the ramifications, goes way beyond abortion. You got pretty slim pickings. So it sounds like he did the best he could with what he had.
I think you're right, and you know, I mentioned earlier that Rehnquist vouched for O'Connor.
Yeah.
Barry Goldwater, then a powerhouse in the
Yeah.
Republican Party, did so as well.
She
Uh,
worked for him, didn't she? Didn't she
pardon,
work for? Didn't she do some
she
work
had
with Goldwater?
for Goldwater was very close. You couldn't be successful in Arizona politics
Yes,
in
right.
the
That's
'60s
true.
or the '70s or the '80s, and of course O'Connor was on the court then without being close to Barry Goldwater.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
so, so she had leading conservatives vouching for her. But you know, when you speak about strength, it's to her credit that you know she stood up for her views on that issue. And you're quite right. People in the Reagan crowd and the conservative crowd generally were pretty upset with her. Certainly, Justice Scalia was when she wrote an opinion in an abortion case. His angry dissent began with, "This cannot be taken seriously." What a
Ooh,
slap! What a
yes.
slap to a colleague on the court.
Mhm.
Um, Judicial observers commented at the time, well, if you think you ever had a chance of winning her over, you just lost it. A single comment was never going to lose a
Yeah,
woman
yeah.
of Justice O'Connor's confidence and stature, but
Yeah.
he certainly didn't help himself.
No, 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 no. Yeah, you weren't getting on her good side with, you know, slamming her like that. And also, I think it's that kind of condescension on women that, you know, it's sort of like, well, go back and how to say, how fast can you type? You know, it's one of those. It's
Yeah,
almost a comment like that. You know, um,
yeah.
let's talk about. You've mentioned a few things that you know she was noted for in terms of decisions, but I'd like to get a little bit more under the hood on them. One is like separation of church and state.
Mm.
What would you say her philosophy was on separation of church and state?
Well, she was very committed to the separation because she was a keen student of history. She understood the founders' commitment to separating church and state and the reasons for that. Because history demonstrated that people could behave rabidly in the name of their God and kill others in the name of religion. So she understood that. Like all justices, she had to wrestle with the question of accommodation. How much can the state do to support religion, if only indirectly, without a direct level of support or aid or assistance? But because she was not an absolutist, there were very few in the court's history, if any, who would be absolutists. So the question always was, knowing that there has to be separation of church and state, are there some areas where the government could aid religion if they are neutral benefits? And she came out of that school, which the
Mm.
court's jurisprudence had begun to generate in the early 1950s. But she was opposed, for example, to having the Ten Commandments in the school. That's too oppressive. She did not permit the state to have a big, could not trench on religion, because this was the other side of it, to protect religious liberty. So her
What do you mean when you say trench on religion?
to violate religious liberty, right? Yeah,
Okay.
so that's that, right. In her view, and I think she was correct, the reason for separation of church and state is fundamentally to protect religious liberty. If you keep the government out of religion, as Madison and Jefferson believed, then people can make their choices. The problem develops when the government begins to play a role in religion. And Madison's answer to the question, well, what if a church is going to fail without governmental assistance? Well, then
It
people will
fails.
find another church, right?
Exactly.
That's the ultimate test of the marketplace, if we wanted to apply that metaphor to the realm of religion. And of course, it was, the founders considered it to be tyrannical to require people to tithe or to pay taxes to support religion. And so O'Connor very much came out of that background, and found a centrist way of protecting separation of church and state in her years on the court.
Mm-hmm. So one of the other areas that she was noted for was the Fourth Amendment, search and seizure. What was her ideas about that?
She was very concerned to protect citizens from unreasonable search and seizure. In many ways, this was, I think, born of her upbringing. If you lead an isolated life, the closest house to yours is 12 miles away. The closest town is 35 miles. You value your privacy. You value your independence. I think the same could be said of why Justice Souter was good on the issue of privacy, and she and Souter became good friends, by the way. So I think that her interest in protecting um, citizens from unreasonable search and seizure probably was born of her early upbringing, and her idea of allowing independence.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. She, of course, ruled on issues like abortion. What were there other issues, women's issues that she ruled on?
Yes, well, I think everybody's interested in knowing about the very important 1996 decision that had a direct bearing on women's rights, called Virginia Military Institute. And this was the Virginia Military Institute case, involved the application by a young woman to attend VMI, a very distinguished, prestigious, historically all male school. So here's a young woman who wants to become a cadet. Under the law, she couldn't. So it was O'Connor teaming up with Ginsburg, who formed a majority to overturn VMI's practice, and thus now reversing 100 odd years of history. And here's the interesting part, and it says a lot about Justice O'Connor, I think, Lawrence, um, because the Chief Justice at that time, Rehnquist, voted the other way. He was in the minority. That meant that the justice with the most seniority would choose whom to assign to write the opinion, and that was Justice John Paul Stevens. He naturally turned to Justice O'Connor, thinking, "You've worked hard on this. You can write this opinion." But O'Connor and Justice Ginsburg had become good friends. Ginsburg had been on the court now for 3 years, and Ginsburg, of course, had carved out a reputation for advancing women's rights. And she very generously said, "No, I think this is Ruth's case." So she gave RBG the opportunity to write this historic decision, when she might well have claimed that by seniority. It was her choice first. But that showed her generosity, her willingness uh, to be the bigger woman in this case. And but she had also written other opinions that acknowledged the right of women to be free from gender discrimination. It's interesting. She was a trailblazer, not a marcher in the street. It wasn't her. It wasn't in her nature to do that, and she wasn't known as the overarching advocate for women's rights in the courtroom, which is how RBG earned her reputation. And some think that maybe she achieved that much because she was a centrist. She could find a way to produce a patchwork quilt among the justices to form a consensus. But that was a very important decision. Planned Parenthood is probably the one on abortion that she's best known for. You know, another area that's very important, and people were writing about this when she passed away last week, was her decision on affirmative action. When she wrote the Supreme Court's decision in 2003 upholding the affirmative action program at University of Michigan's law school, which was very important to her. She commented on the importance of diversity in American life. And she noted that businesses, corporations, everybody in America is a beneficiary of diversity. And certainly businesses and corporations want their future employees to be in a classroom that includes a diverse makeup, because it would not be wise to have students attending an all white class and then have to go to Asia or other parts of the world and deal for the first time with people who don't look like them. So, but what she's remembered for in that decision is that she hoped in 25 years, affirmative action would no longer be necessary. That was her hope, because that's the great hope for all of us. I'm in this school who believed in the importance of affirmative action because it accomplished a lot. It was her hope, as it would be mine, that the day we would reach this point in American society where we would not need any of those programs to protect those who had been the victims of racial discrimination or gender discrimination.
That was kind of the point of affirmative action, was to bring us to a point where we wouldn't need it.
Exactly. It was a temporary relief, wasn't a Band-Aid, so to speak. You'd not want it to be permanent, you'd hope.
Yeah. I thought it was, in addition to being, a Band-Aid, though, it was to create the atmosphere where people could actually get to know each other. Because if you never met anybody at work and you were working all those hours, and you never met anybody in church on the occasion that you went to church, you never met anybody in schools and all these institutions, where was it going to happen that Americans had the opportunity to get to know somebody other than a figure, a caricature in the newspaper or something like that? So it seems to me that was the point. Now, we can argue about the shortcomings of what should have happened after affirmative action, and I think that's a reasonable conversation to have. But anyway, I think that was the point.
Yeah. Well, I agree. You're certainly right about that. And of course, the reality is, as she anticipated, Justice Alito would be involved in overturning her important opinions. So she would essentially pass away a disappointed woman. Of course, in her last years, she was afflicted with dementia and could not have been aware, but she certainly was right in anticipating. And so her decision to retire in 2006 from the court to care for her ailing husband, John, who was suffering from dementia, trying to squeeze out as much time together as he had left her very frustrated and disappointed, because he was essentially he had fallen so deeply into the state of dementia, he didn't recognize her after 5 months. And then she realized, she said to friends, "What have I done?" It was the worst decision she had made, because now because she would have had many more years on the court. Let's say another 10 years.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Because
Yeah.
she was writing at kind of the same age as RBG, right?
Yeah, she herself began to decline in around 2014 or so, began to slip a little bit, but then her decline was slower. Um,
Mm, mm,
but
mm.
but nevertheless, we would
Yeah,
have had another 8 or 10 years on the court, and a
right.
lot of people, myself included, would have preferred to have another decade of Justice O'Connor than a
Yeah,
decade of Samuel
Alito.
Alito.
Alito. Yeah, yeah. Uh, I'll open it up again to our esteemed panel here. If anybody has any comments, questions, memories. Talk about memories right after dementia.
Yeah.
um, okay, so I would like to talk now about the overall impact of a Supreme Court on the ebb and flow of our lives as individual citizens, because they make grand overarching decisions that are overarching even of our elected representatives, and they have lifetime appointments, and they're still human, even if we like to think of them as having superior judgment. I don't think that can always be successfully argued in a critical thinking arena, but it's a thing. Can you talk a little bit about the historical impact of the Supreme Court on our history, and then two, how does it affect us in our day-to-day lives?
Mhm. That's such an important topic, Lawrence. The and we should take note of the impact of the court's decisions on the lives of Americans and the life of the nation, because it's huge. And the court historically sometimes has moved right, then it's moved left, and then it's moved back again. But we could look at any number of, of Supreme Court decisions to show the impact on our lives. The landmark decisions, of course, are important, whether we're talking about Brown versus the Board of Education of 1954, a decision of singular importance in striking down segregation in public schools that then paved the way for removing the barriers in all other areas of our public life. That changed America in a huge way. We can think about, if we talk about the impact of the court's decisions in the lives of Americans, we could look at the infamous Korematsu decision in 1944 that upheld the presidential executive order and the statute that required the forcible removal of Japanese American citizens from their homes in California to interior parts of the country, because it was alleged, falsely so, and on racist basis, I would say, that they represented a security threat to the United States, that they would be more loyal to the Japanese Empire than the United States. That's 125,000 American citizens who, in one fell swoop, by virtue of the Supreme Court's decision, lost everything they had. That's
Exactly.
an example. So, but if you look at Roe versus Wade, upholding for the first time a woman's right to abortion, look at the freedom, the liberty, the choice that women would now have to govern their own reproductive organs. So we could look at any number of decisions, for good or ill, that affected the lives of individuals. If we look a little bit more broadly on the decisions affecting the life of the nation, think about, as we were discussing earlier, the court's decision in Bush versus Gore that basically led to the seating of one person over the other in the White House, and all that it implied for the future of the country over the next 4 or 8 years. A huge difference. Or think about the Supreme Court's decision in United States versus Nixon, the Watergate tapes case requiring President Nixon to turn over the audio tapes that revealed that the president indeed was a crook, and that he was willing to pay bribery money to the Watergate defendants to protect himself and others. And that led to his ouster from the Supreme Court. Or look now, if you want to talk about a big decision, it's in front of us.
In
And
front
it's
of us.
hard
Yep.
to even describe this fast moving case with an enormous name. When you hear
Yes.
the case, United States of America versus Donald J. Trump, is there
Right.
a more awesome name?
Amazing.
Amazing, because I'll tell you, the very future of the rule of law is at stake, and that is, it can't get bigger than this.
No.
And we could spend a lot of time talking about this, as you well know. But if the court ultimately says that the president is immune from criminal prosecution, as former President Trump maintains, that
Mhm.
means the president is above the law, and that
Exactly.
turns the Constitution on its head.
But it
Undermines.
just makes it trashes the whole Constitution, because it says the president, who's the top and the top of the pyramid, the president doesn't, he can make laws for us, but the law doesn't apply to him.
Right. And you're exactly right. And that completely destroys the framers' concept of the rule of law, which at the time of the founding meant precisely the subordination of the executive to the rule of law. That would
Exactly.
have any that would destroy the rule of law, and with it destroy constitutional government, and with it destroy American democracy. You
That's
and
it.
I have never seen a bigger decision in our lifetimes, and no American has ever seen a more consequential decision in the entire 250 years of our country's history. That's big.
That's right. And just recently, they decided about the ability of administrations, not meaning presidential administration, but the administrative government, like all of the departments, just deciding that actually they don't have that much power. It's like, okay, well, if you have people who, you have to have technocrats, because the people you elect, who some of them can't even speak uh,
Yeah.
uh, intelligible English. I have no idea. They don't do critical thinking. If those people have to be in charge of the rules for, let's say, atomic waste,
Yeah.
is that really, do you really want that?
Well, I like this theme that you're hitting on, because we have three branches of government, and the
Mm.
judiciary, as Alexander Hamilton said, would be the least dangerous branch. But historically, it's demonstrated it can change this nation for good or ill,
Yes.
with a singular decision. And what's interesting about that is that the justices have known that they are the gatekeepers. If there's anybody who's more responsible than maintaining the integrity of the judicial process in the United States, I don't know who that would be. It falls on the shoulders of of the nine Supreme Court justices. And so, in another time, in another discussion, one factor that Americans should think about when they go to the polls is this: whom you vote for the office of United States Senate is going to be playing an important role in advice and consent to Supreme Court nominees. It's not just about voting for a president and whether he or she will nominate a particular person. It's that Supreme Court, excuse me, it's that Senate member as well.
That's right.
Huge decision. Yeah.
That's right. And it brings us back to a discussion we've had before, about the importance of the citizen to be like involved in making the decisions, at least for the people that's going to make the decisions. And it's hard work, and it can be complex work. I could not make a stronger case for, like, hey, this is not easy. but the consequences of not doing it is so vast that how can we not try?
Well, you're right. And, that was after Justice O'Connor retired and wondered what to do with her life. She devoted herself to civic education because she
Yeah,
said our freedom depends on the citizenry understanding how our system works. We will lose our freedom if, in fact, people don't understand. And she said, this has to be taught to every generation. And isn't
every
that
generation.
important?
That's right.
Every generation needs to understand how our system works. So civic education needs more emphasis. And that's how she dedicated the last years of her life. And she was delightful. It was, and she would say, perhaps with a little bit of hyperbole, that she thought that what she was doing there was more important than her time on the court. A little
Hmm.
hyperbole, maybe to find a way to justify her decision to leave the court, but very important by any measurement.
That's right. Well, I think that the truth in that is that if you don't get that right, that's you get people like Alito, so you have so in some sense, yeah, it makes sense. You gotta have the citizens who not only believe that it's important, but believe it enough to work for it and to make to hold it as something precious as opposed to, oh, it's so much work. It's raining today. It's cold today. You got people who are giving up their lives, losing limbs and stuff like that in battles that you say that you appreciate their service. But if you don't vote, what's the point of them losing it? What's the point of
Yes.
them sitting in those trenches? You
That's right.
know?
Well, you're so right about that. It goes back to your earlier point involving Bush versus Gore that every vote matters. If
Yeah.
the presidential election comes down to 500 votes, Shirley points out every vote matters, meaning every citizen can make a difference if
Yes.
we try. If we
That's right.
try.
That's right. Well, one last thing. We don't have that much time, but one last thing about the importance of women on the court and not just in the court in the decisions, but the reflection that has and the support. How does that affect our girls and
Mhm.
and young women growing up having that?
That's such an important question, and it was of central importance to Justice O'Connor, by the way, who thought when she joined the court, she knew how important she was not only to women of her generation, but to all young women. And that's why she was so fond of pointing out that it was her goal to demonstrate that she could do the job well, and that other younger women, young girls, would be encouraged, would be inspired to seek the most important positions in our society. She hoped to build a bridge then that others could follow her behind. That was so important. That role models, influences, the inspirational figures uh, are a great teacher and inspire people to become um, senators and future presidents, astronauts, and hold the most important positions in American life. And she bore that responsibility very well. I think nobody would describe her as a disappointment. She was a
Mm.
success in every way. Even if you disagree with some of her political views or judicial decisions, there probably could not have been a better first female justice.
Yes. Well, I certainly would agree that this is those kind of appointments, and being a first is just like the foot in the door. And we hope that it's that her legacy, at least as a first woman Supreme Court justice, will serve to bring women in more into many roles, not just Supreme Court, of course, but and especially it serves as how can I say it serves as an example of how we miss so many talented people when we marginalize people because of gender or race or religion or all of those kind of things, which has nothing to do with the job. When we marginalize people and those kind of IQs, they go unutilized. And those are some of our most precious resources, are the people in our country. They if it's not them, then what is this all about anyway?
Yeah.
With that said, thanks again for a wonderful conversation, David, and look forward to seeing you again. I'm still trying to organize my thoughts in some kind of project that we can work together on.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for having me, Lawrence, and happy holidays to you.
Happy holidays. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. See you next time, next week, same time, same station, brand new show.